Let's be honest, this isn't a transition. This is a turning point. The world of rules and certainties didn't end gradually, it shattered. And turning points are tricky because we only realize them when it's too late. A few years ago, these words would have seemed exaggerated. These words were spoken in Davos by Canada's Prime Minister, a country once seen as stable and effective. When such a leader calls it a turning point, not just a transition, something major has shifted. The question isn't if the world is changing, but what kind of world we'll wake up in after this turning point. That's what we'll discuss today. A world that is falling apart. When we mention a turning point today, we don't mean an emotion or chaos. We're talking about a major shift in long-standing logic, a world where belief in rules is now at a turning point. Although imperfect, they were ultimately binding for everyone, that agreements have weight, and that economic interconnectedness automatically lowers conflict risk. These three pillars are now systematically falling apart, though not all at once or dramatically. And that's exactly why this process is so dangerous. It doesn't come as a shock, but as a gradual emptying of the meaning of the words on which the entire post-war order stood. This time in Davos, it wasn't a radical or a critic of the system from the outside who said it. It was the Prime Minister of Canada, a country that has gained from managed world rules more than most. A country that for many years was proof that compromise, integration, and multilateral cooperation work. And that's exactly why his words were so important. Until recently, people only spoke quietly about something in them. That we can no longer pretend to benefit mutually from integration in a situation that is a source of subordination. In other words, interconnectedness is no longer neutral. It can be an advantage, but also a weakness. It depends on who's in control. It was just as openly admitted that the strongest have always made exceptions whenever it suited them. Not because the system failed by accident, but because power tends to bend the rules. And the greater the imbalance of power, the less the rules actually matter. This is not a moral judgment, it's a description of reality. A reality where law, economics, and security are increasingly subject to power rather than the reverse, and in which states that relied on the system suddenly find that the system no longer protects them. This is where the great power shift begins, not in war, not in a single crisis, but in the loss of faith that rules apply even when they are inconvenient. And if this faith disappears, the world that stood on it disappears as well. Why Carney in particular? If the same words were spoken by a leader known for confrontational rhetoric, hardly anyone would pay much attention to them. They would be perceived as a political stance, maybe as a tactic, maybe as an attempt to attract attention. That's why it's important who said these words. Mark Carney is not a politician who builds his career on crisis rhetoric. He is not a leader from the fringes of the system, nor an outsider critic of globalization. On the contrary, for many years, he was one of its architects. He moved in the circles of central banks, global institutions, financial forums, and rules that were meant to stabilize the world. In the world he now claims is broken. Moreover, Canada has never been a power that enforced rules by force. It's a typical example of a country that benefited from a rules-based order, security through alliances, prosperity through trade, influence through diplomacy. If anyone had a reason to believe that the system works, it was Canada. And that's exactly why Carney's words are so troubling. They don't sound like a call for revolution. They sound like a statement of fact. Like the diagnosis of someone who has been inside for a long time and now says, this is no longer the world we used to rely on. When Carney talks about a breaking point, he's not talking about a single crisis. He's not just referring to the pandemic, war, or economic shock individually. He refers to experiences that have shown the system only works when it benefits the strongest. And the moment it stops being beneficial, the rules are pushed aside. It's also important what Carney doesn't do. He isn't asking to go back to the past. He doesn't call globalization a mistake. He doesn't suggest the world should isolate itself. His message is colder, which makes it more convincing. He says the old assumptions don't apply anymore, and insisting on them will cost us. Even if the voice once symbolizing stability and trust now speaks of a turning point, it's no reason to panic. It's a signal that reality has shifted faster than our thinking. And this brings us to the next question. What if Carney is right? What if integration shifts from bringing prosperity to creating vulnerability? Where do we see this happening? And how did economic interconnection become a tool of coercion? When integration starts to hurt, for many years, a simple idea prevailed. The more economically interconnected countries are, the less reason they have to go against each other. Trade was supposed to dampen conflicts. Dependencies were supposed to create stability. Integration was meant to be a guarantee of peace and prosperity. Today, this assumption is running into reality, not because it was completely wrong, but because it stopped being valid symmetrically. The moment interconnectedness becomes one-sided, it turns into a weakness. And weaknesses in geopolitics are not ignored, they are exploited. That's what Carney means when he says you can't live in the illusion of mutual benefit if integration leads to subordination. It's not about rejecting cooperation, it's about recognizing that cooperation without balance creates leverage. And leverage is a form of power. We see this in the energy sector. Dependence, which for years was considered rational and cheap, turned into a political weapon in a moment of crisis. We see this in trade. Markets that were supposed to be open are closing selectively. Access is granted or taken away not according to rules, but according to political obedience. We see this also in technology and supply chains. Components, raw materials, and infrastructure are becoming tools of pressure, not tanks, but licenses. Not armies, but tariffs. Not occupation, but disconnection. And this is exactly where the logic of globalization breaks down. Integration is no longer neutral. It's not automatically good or automatically bad. It becomes a strategic question. Who controls the nodes? Who has alternatives? Who has the ability to withstand pressure longer than the others? For medium and smaller states, this is a fundamental change. The world where you could rely on openness and cooperation always being rewarded is disappearing. A world where openness lacks safeguards creates vulnerability, and cooperation without balance means dependence. This is not an argument against integration, it is an argument for reconsidering it. More countries today are asking, where is the line between beneficial interconnectedness and risky dependence? And when that line is crossed, another problem arises. If the rules stop protecting the weaker and integration starts serving the stronger, what is really left of the rules of an orderly system? This is where we reach another layer of the great power divide. A world where rules formally exist, but in practice, they only apply to some. Rules applying to only some. Rules only make sense if they apply to everyone. The moment they become recommendations for the weak and restrictions only for those who don't have the power to bypass them, they stop working. Not formally, but in reality. That's exactly what Carney is talking about when he points out that the strongest have always made exceptions for themselves whenever it suited them, not by accident. Not exceptionally, but systematically. And that's exactly the core of today's problem. It's not that the rules have disappeared. It's that they are applied selectively. We see this in international law. Sovereignty, territorial integrity, and bans on force are upheld only if they don't conflict with strategic interests. Then they are relativized, bypassed, or simply ignored, without real consequences for those who have enough power. We see this in trade. The free market and fair competition last only while they're beneficial. When they're not, tariffs, subsidies, and restrictions are used instead. Not as a temporary solution, but as the new normal. The rules stay the same, but their interpretation changes. We see it even in institutions meant to ensure balance. Organizations meant to resolve disputes now often just acknowledge their existence. The mechanisms remain, but the authority has become hollow. And without authority, rules become just paper. The result is a world in which law is increasingly subordinated to power. Not openly, not officially, but in fact. Countries that have the capacity to bear the costs of breaking the rules can afford more. The others are faced with a choice: adapt or take risks. For the central states, it's existential. For decades, they built their security and prosperity on the assumption that the rules would protect them from the pressure of the stronger. If this assumption falls apart, the foundation of their strategy falls apart as well, and this is where the great power shift enters its next phase. If the rules no longer serve their protective function, the world is not organized around norms, but around blocks, not around agreements, but around power. The question isn't who is right anymore, but who has the power to enforce their view of reality. Here we come to the greatest paradox of today's world. The rules aren't collapsing due to outside interference. They are falling apart because those who once created, enforced, and guaranteed them have stopped following them consistently. If the system ceases to be binding for its main guarantor, it cannot remain binding for anyone else. And this is where the paradox of American power begins. The paradox of a country that benefited the most from the world order and at the same time is now disrupting it the most. The paradox of American power. At this point, the great power shift reveals its full irony. The world order that is falling apart today was not created by its enemies. It was created by the United States of America. After World War II, they designed it, enforced it, financed it, and maintained it for decades. And at the same time, they benefited from it more than anyone else. American influence was not based only on military strength, but on the system. On trade rules, financial institutions, security alliances, and standards that made the world predictable. This order was not altruistic, it was advantageous. For the United States, it meant stability, access to markets, global reach of the dollar, and political weight without the need for constant confrontation. And this is where the paradox arises. When the United States began to feel constrained by its own system, it started to bypass it, not because the values changed, but because the balance of power changed. The world whose rules were meant to bind others began to restrict them as well. A new approach gradually emerged. Rules apply as long as they serve American interests. When they stop serving, they become an obstacle. And obstacles are not respected in geopolitics. They are removed. Unilaterally, selectively, pragmatically. But this disrupted the system's foundation. If the main guarantor stops believing the rules are binding, he can't expect others to believe in them either. If their main protector starts bypassing them, rules become optional. Optional rules are just recommendations. This doesn't mean the United States is now an enemy of the system. It means they've started acting like a great power in an era where rules give way to power. By trying to protect their position, they sped up the collapse of the order that supported it. This sends a key signal to the rest of the world. If even the country that created the system no longer considers it binding, why should anyone else? Why respect limits ignored by the one who enforced them? That's how a major power shift becomes global. It's no longer only a conflict between the West and its rivals. It's about questioning whether order can last without a strong will to maintain it. When the architect loses faith in his building, the issue goes beyond the system. The problem is what will replace it. If the rules stop being binding even for those who created them, the world will not return to them. It will not try to fix them. It will be rearranged anew, not around norms, but around power, not around agreements, but around interests, not around rules, but around blocks. And that is exactly how the great power shift closes into a new form of the world, a world of blocks, not of rules, a world of blocks, not of rules. When rules stop working as a universal framework, the world will find a replacement, not an ideal one, not a just one, but a functional one. This replacement is not new norms or reformed institutions. It is blocks. The world isn't starting to divide because countries suddenly stop talking to each other. It's dividing because they no longer believe that rules will protect them in a moment of crisis. And when rules fail, what matters is belonging. Who is with whom? Who covers for whom? Who has the capacity to respond? Blocks aren't ideological projects. They're defensive, formed to reduce vulnerability rather than spread values. That's why today we see a world organized around security, economic, and technological groupings, not around universal rules. It's not just about the great powers. They have always formed blocks. The difference is that today, even medium and smaller states are being pushed into this. Neutrality is no longer a strategy. It becomes a risk. Because in a system without firm rules, standing aside means having no protection. Block-based and rules-based worlds operate differently. It doesn't reward those who are right, but those who have backing. It doesn't automatically protect the weak. It only protects those who are part of a larger whole. And the more resilient this whole is, the more bargaining power it has. We see this in trade, where access to markets is increasingly tied to political compatibility. We see this in technology, where standards, infrastructure, and data are becoming block issues. We see this in security, where formal commitments complement or replace informal guarantees based on power. In such a world, the meaning of terms like partnership or alliance is also changing. They cease to be moral categories. They become practical. It's not about who shares values, but about who is able to bear the costs of solidarity in times of pressure. That doesn't mean a return to the original Cold War. It's a more fragmented, less transparent system, where blocks are not always solid and lines can shift, but the basic logic is the same. Security and prosperity are no longer based on universal rules, but start to depend on belonging. At this point, the great power shift becomes personal for every country. As in a world of blocks, just believing the rules will work isn't enough. You have to answer a much more uncomfortable question. Which block do I belong to? And what am I willing to do to make sure it protects me? Because in a system where the rules have lost their power, the biggest risk isn't making a bad decision. The biggest risk is not making a decision at all. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. This sentence has long served as a diplomatic warning. Now it's no longer just a metaphor. When rules lose their universal weight and blocks replace norms, it reflects reality. Being at the table no longer means having the truth, arguments, or the support of international law. It means having weight, capacity, allies who are willing to bear the costs. In systems where strength and resilience guide decisions, isolation is a weakness, a major shift in mindset for middle states. For decades, they could rely on the system to protect them. The rules would balance power, and integration would lower risks. Today, these certainties are disappearing, and with them, the luxury of ambiguity. That doesn't mean the world is heading toward permanent conflict. Politics is returning to decision-making of choices, of priorities. Countries are forced to clarify what they consider existential interests, where their red lines are, and who is willing to stand by them when the pressure increases. In this context, Carney's words make sense. He is not talking about the end of cooperation. He is talking about the end of illusions, about the fact that the world no longer works on the automatic settings of the past, and that insisting on them is riskier than accepting the new reality. A shift in world powers is a process, not a single event. And that process changes the way decisions are made, deals are struck, and alliances are built. Whoever understands this in time will gain room to maneuver. Those who don't will only react when they're under pressure. This is not a call for panic. It's a call for sobriety. The world hasn't collapsed. It has changed. In this world, we can't rely on rules to protect us. In the era of blocks and selective rules, a simple logic prevails. If you're not at the table, others decide for you. If decisions are made without you, you'll quickly be on the menu.
If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe so you don't miss future content. You can also support my work with gratitude. And if you want to help the video reach more people, click on praise. I appreciate it.